that what really underlies all this passion and perseverance that is the kind of obvious phenotype, if you will, of grit is like an alignment. What do I mean? Well, what I do and what I say and what I want and what I want to want and what I want to want to want. And in fact, my highest level, like it's all aligned. There's a kind of harmony.
That was Dr. Angela Duckworth on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 4 clinical psychologists here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and co-author of ACT Daily Journal.
I'm Dr. Diana Hill, co-author with Debbie on ACT Daily Journal and practicing in Seaside, Santa Barbara, California.
From coast to coast, I'm Dr. Yael Schonbrunn, a Boston-based clinical psychologist and assistant professor at Brown University.
And from sunny San Diego, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty and the Big Book of ACT Metaphors.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. Psychologists Off the Clock is supported by Praxis Continuing Education. With Praxis Continuing Education, you can really transform your clients' lives. You can learn how to effectively promote lasting change with evidence-based training, and it's really the premier provider of continuing education for clinical professionals. You can earn CEs if you're a psychologist, social worker, counselor, behavior analyst, MFT, physician, nurse, and more.
And Praxis has both on-demand courses and live online courses. Right now, you can get ACT Immersion or ACT in Practice with Steve Hayes, as well as ACT 1 with Matt Boone, and Focused ACT for brief interventions with Kirk Strosahl and Patty Robinson. Those are the on-demand courses. And live self-care and radical healing among BIPOC therapists on the front lines, culturally tailored ACT, fundamentals of DBT, ACT in behavior analysis, superhero therapy, and more.
So go to our website, offtheclockpsych.com, and you'll get a coupon code for the live courses there. Check us out at offtheclockpsych.com.
Hi, this is Yael, here to introduce our 200th episode. So I'm here with Debbie, Diana, and Jill, and we're introducing an episode that features Angela Duckworth, who wrote one of my favorite all-time books called Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. And we are at episode 200, and it took a lot of grit to get here. Diana and Debbie started this several years ago, and it's gone through a lot of evolutions and transformations and different representations, but it's always been something that we keep coming back to because we are passionate about it, and that passion helps us to persevere. So we wanted to talk a little bit about passion and perseverance in the podcast and sort of what it's taken and what the joy is in doing this kind of work. So Debbie, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, I mean, it's been 4.5 years. We would not have kept doing it that long, I think, if the passion wasn't there, if we didn't get some vitality from it and some joy and fun from it. And it definitely takes perseverance at times. There's times when this is a lot. And I just have a quick recent example. The work ebbs and flows with a podcast. We can go for stretches. Since there's 4 of us, we can go through stretches where we're not doing a whole lot of work on it because our co-hosts are carrying the load. But then I had a period recently where I just had a lot of podcast work all at once. And to be honest, I also had some other stressors going on, and I was just feeling a little tired, and I had to prepare for an episode coming up, and I really just had to persevere. I would have probably rather gone to bed earlier than stay up late prepping my questions. And so I think, we have to be a little gritty to keep doing this.
So this is Diana. And 2 things that really stood out for me in your conversation with Angela Duckworth. And I think let's just pause and say, holy moly, we have Angela Duckworth on the show today, episode 200. And to have such a powerhouse woman that is also so incredibly just important for us in our own lives. So it's incredible to have her on. But 2 things that really stood out for me that she talked about were, first, this conversation that you had around when to grit and when to quit. And then the second conversation where she turned the tables on you, Yael, and you talked about ACT. And for me, when I think about the podcast and just grit in my own life and when to grit and when to quit, I really think it has to really boil down to values. and what are the values for me in doing this? Because there are times when we do need to quit things. And that when it's the functionality of grit is actually leading us away from our values, when we're just continuing to strive and pursue and we're going in directions that don't matter to us, I don't think that's grit used in a helpful, wholesome way. But for me, it's like, how do you use grit to pursue what you care about? For me on the podcast, it's about sharing these ideas that have been profoundly impactful for me in my personal life, but also in my clinical work with people, with moms, with parents, with people that are in relationships, so that it can actually improve their lives for the better. And so know when to grit and when to quit, and use your values as your guide.
That's cute. You got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them.
Exactly.
Well, for me, this is Jill. I really liked the part of your conversation, Yael, where you guys were talking about dissemination of science. And I think that what makes me feel the most passionate about this podcast is that we have this unique opportunity, this platform to share science-backed ideas from psychology with the public in a way that, they otherwise wouldn't necessarily have access to. And that just makes me feel so good. I feel so passionate to know that we're able to help. I mean, we're at like 1.3 million downloads of this podcast now. Like, that's incredible to think how many people are being reached with this really important and helpful information. And so it feels, just like Diana said, it feels really worth it to persevere even when it gets hard, even though this isn't paying our salaries. But to persevere when it gets hard because it feels so values aligned. And I love the three of you. I just think being able to work together in this team is one of the greatest gifts of my life. And I feel passionate about working with other amazing women too.
I feel the same. And this is Yael. For me, the conversation and book in general just really emphasized the importance of having clear values and like why you're doing something, because that helps to really bring your passion to the fore and creates a compass, like why you're doing it and how to keep doing it even when it's hard. And Angela Duckworth has a really nice way of articulating her core value, which has a lot to do with translating science to the public. And I would say, Jill, you have a really similar one, and so do I. And mine is specifically in translating science about relationships, both between people and in couples, parents and children, but also relationships between roles, which is kind of where my interest in work and family comes from. And translating the science to the public in accessible ways feels really important. And having that clarity helps me overcome the kinds of things that come up for me regularly, which is like a lot of emotional discomfort. Like, for example, in the lead up to the interview with Angela Duckworth, who's, you'll hear me fangirling out in my interview with her, I was tremendously nervous. And there was many, many times that I had the thought, like, I just wish I hadn't signed up for it. It's like overwhelming. I'm going to embarrass myself. Now Angela Duckworth is going to know that I'm kind of a dodo. And, in the middle of the interview, I'm having all these really self-critical thoughts and having that clarity of like, I'm doing this for a reason. And being able to kind of reconnect to that value helped me to also remember, like, enjoy this moment. You're talking to Angela Duckworth. How cool is that? And so being able to connect both to the passion and the reason to persist can kind of open you up to other gifts that come along the way. And I think that's, where the power of grit really lies.
And Yael, we had a conversation on the eve of the Angela Duckworth, Kristen Neff powerhouse interviews that are coming out back to back, because I think that's the other part of this, is that there's a behind the scenes of the power of women supporting each other and calling each other and saying, hey, can you help me get through this interview? Or can we talk it through it was evening, you'd put the kids down to bed, and talking through our anxieties and also supporting and encouraging each other. And I think that grit is best done when we do it in support.
That collaboration piece is so key. Yeah. So happy 200th episode, ladies. And thank you to all of our listeners, and to Melissa and Katie and Michael, who are the behind the scenes team that make this engine run. Today I'm delighted to be speaking with Professor Angela Duckworth from the University of Pennsylvania. She's the founder and scientific director of the Character Lab, a nonprofit whose mission is to advance science that helps kids thrive. She is a 2013 MacArthur Genius Fellow. Angela studies grit and self-control, attributes that powerfully predict success and well-being, even over and above IQ or talent. She's also author of the best-selling book Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance, and a podcast co-host of one of my favorite shows that boasts a terrific title, No Stupid Questions. Angela has advised the White House, the World Bank, the NBA and NFL, and Fortune 500 CEOs. She's received numerous awards for her contributions to education, and prior to her career in research, she was a math and science teacher at public schools in New York, San Francisco, and Philadelphia. I just want to start off by thanking you for joining me for our Psychologists Off the Clock 200th episode.
Thank you. This is great.
It's certainly no accident that I wanted you to come on to talk about grit, because it took us a lot of grit to make it to the 200th episode. But before we get into talking about grit, I actually have gotten very excited about your No Stupid Questions Asked podcast. I love it. It's such a fun conversation that you and Stephen Dubner have going. I love that you guys have such a warm but also slightly snarky relationship with one another, and that you use social science to answer all these really
That's a good description.
Quite provocative questions. All right, so let's maybe start off with having you give a definition of grit, because sort of in the popular sphere, it can get a little watered down or even distorted. And then I was just curious if you could give us the definition, but also help clarify how grit is associated with achievement.
It was in my first year of graduate school when my advisor said, what's the name of this thing that you keep talking about as a predictor of achievement that is so different from measures of talent or IQ? And I had described people who stick with things over really long periods, for years or even decades in adulthood. And, they're just relentless. They're so tenacious. They're also obsessed, like they think about what they're doing all the time, voluntarily, not through coercion. And I didn't think it mattered very much that I didn't have a word for it. I was like, well, why do we want to stop what we're doing to think about what to call it? And Marty Seligman, who was my PhD advisor, now my colleague at Penn, actually refused to keep meeting with me until I had a name for it. He was like, oh, well, this meeting's over. And I was like, what do you mean this meeting's over? He was like, well, I don't want to talk about it until you know what to call it. So I remember coming in with a legal notepad with all these words I had written out. I think I'd gone to thesauruses or whatever. I was like, persistence, tenacity, stick-to-itiveness, grit. And Marty was like, hold on, grit? And I was like, grit, true grit, like John Wayne, grit, like grit. And he was like, yeah, that's grit. All right, now we can keep talking.
Now you can come back to having meetings.
Yeah, now we can keep doing science. So, Marty is an unusual scientist. And for those who don't know, he's well known today as being a positive psychologist, like somebody who helped christen the scientific study of happiness. Before that, though, he was a world-renowned clinical psychologist who was credited with some of the foundational animal research on depression. Right before Marty, there weren't animal models of depression. And so Marty's a great scientist. But the other thing that is remarkable about Marty is, or at least one other thing, is he really is a world-class communicator. And before the kind of books that we take for granted and the sort of, TED Talk podcast conversation that we might have about behavioral science, Marty was ahead of his time in writing books like Learned Optimism that, tried to communicate scientific insights to a broader audience. So that's why, we stopped everything we were doing to call this combination of passion and perseverance for long-term goals what I call it today, which is grit. And, to your question, Yael, the reason I got excited about it is because I had come to graduate school to try to fix the achievement gap that I saw in my work as a classroom teacher. And I had the intuition that the kids that I was trying to teach math were actually fully intellectually capable of learning how to get Y or X all by itself in an equation. It's not like they weren't smart enough to do that, but somehow had not unlocked their sustained motivation. So there's lots of things that go into how much effort somebody puts forth to learn something or do something. But I do think that stamina, you say like, this is the 200th podcast. Like there's so many things that get in the way along the way of doing anything important that to some extent, a stick-to-itiveness, a grit about what you're doing is important because of the nature of achievement.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I want to pull out there. One is this piece of communication that is really important, that what we call things really matters. And I want to actually come back to that through the interview, because I think that to some extent it can get misinterpreted no matter what you call it. And yet we do have to pick labels for things, especially in the service of communicating our ideas. And that's an important just truth in science, that how we communicate our findings really matters. And yet words can never capture sort of the essence of a thing that you're trying to describe. And that's one of the challenges, I think, in academic science getting translated out into the popular press. The other thing that I got to admit that one of the central reasons that I wanted to bring you on was this idea of how this idea of grit really plays out in real life. And one of the areas that I write a lot about, and I'm actually working on a book about working parenthood. And so when we talk about persistence towards a goal and having, passion that can help us sustain in our persistence, a lot of what you write about is sort of like a singular goal. But I actually wanted to have you talk a little bit about your personal experience, because as I understand it, when you started graduate school, you were a young mother. And if I'm correct in my timeline, you had a second child while you were a graduate student. And so I'm curious for you how you see the persistence towards like your professional goal being sort of impinged by your parenthood. And I'll say just one more thing that I'll probably use too many words to describe. But one of the things that I write about is this concept of work-family enrichment. So we talk a lot about the conflict between these two domains. And at the same time, there's also evidence that suggests that the two roles can actually feed each other. They can nurture each other in really important ways by buffering stress, by this additive effect of enriching life, and then also through skill transfer. And I think those last two are particularly important for the development of grit and sort of how grit translates into achievement over time. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of how grit fits into working parenthood, and in fact, maybe how working parenthood can help grit grow.
When I started graduate school, I was 32, and you're exactly right, Yael. I was already a mom of a toddler, somewhere between infant and toddler, if there's a name for that. And then I was pregnant with my second daughter, right then in the first year. And I, in some ways, had the funny experience of growing up as a mom and growing up as a psychologist at exactly the same time. It certainly gave a whole new dimension to my appreciation of developmental psychology when I was learning what little kids were supposed to be able to do at different stages. And I think that, to your point about work-family enrichment, nobody ever wants to generalize from their one experience personally to like all moms or all parents, but to some extent, like it's the only story So I'll just share a little bit of what it was like for me. Fortunately, my two daughters didn't have, major health problems that I think create special stress. I had these two healthy little girls, and I had a working husband. My husband we both grew up a lot, by the way, in the last 2 decades. And I think at the beginning of his career, I mean, when I say he was like a hard worker, like he would probably agree with me, like maybe a little too hard of a worker. So we had a lot of juggling to do, right? With a baby in the house, a baby on the way, his job and career, my beginning of graduate school. So it's not to say that there wasn't some balancing to do, but to your point about enrichment, I personally found, and maybe I was just lucky because I was a psychologist who happened to be studying human development, and then a mom whose job was essentially human development. But to me, there was a lot of complementarity. So I would come home having learned about executive function and prefrontal cortex, and then I would just be like watching my kids and, observing when they did or didn't seem to be using the front part of their brains. So there was a lot of enrichment that went like to my psychological, intuitions getting sharper from being a mom. I thought it was a great convenience to have two kids that I could run experiments on, which I totally did. I'd be like, okay, Amanda, sit here. See this marshmallow? If you can wait. And I literally did the marshmallow task on them and variations thereof. I also, as they got older, would just ask them questions about what they believed, that, how they saw things. And so it was enormously enriching in that direction, right? From parenthood to professional development. And then in terms of the other way, right? Like I think I wasn't enriched and enabled as a parent because, the parenting is so hard, as you know, and it was really helpful to me to have like an intellectual framework to understand things. It wasn't just all stories and examples from my own experience. I, kind of knew what Piaget said. And I also knew what Walter Mischel said. And I, think it was actually very helpful. One of the reasons I think your podcast is so exciting is that, 100 years ago, this kind of scientific understanding of what's going on with people and children and development and motivation and emotion, like it was all hearsay and anecdote. And well, my grandmother told me this. So I thought it was great to have some intellectual framework, that it wasn't just, me trying to navigate completely by my own personal intuitions. So I thought it was a pretty two-way enriching experience. I think I was very lucky. I don't want to extrapolate too much, in part because we could afford childcare and we had an au pair, one of the best but also luxurious decisions or privileged decisions anybody could make. We had like double childcare. So if the childcare was closed, the au pair could, like if my daughter was sick, then like she could stay home with the au pair. So there were a lot of affordances that I had, that maybe enabled me to benefit, like in this two-way exchange. And I, again, don't want to generalize, but yeah, I'm very lucky to have been a mom and a graduate student at the same time.
Yeah. And I think that sort of noting the privilege is a helpful thing, but I guess even just zooming out a bit more. So I've conducted dozens of interviews with working parents of various backgrounds. And I think what's very interesting is that if you get people to think about like, what are their passions and where are they able to persist, they're often able to pull out more positive elements. I mean, that's kind of the gift of positive psychology. Is like when we think more about the positive things, they tend to come more to the fore. And I've done interviews like with a woman who worked at a utility call center and a man who was a cruise ship room attendant. And even in those, less privileged, more challenging professional spheres, and even for parents with kids who have disabilities or other challenges, that people can find ways that parenting enriches their work and that work enriches their parenting. And what I think is kind of cool in the grit sphere, again, if we're talking about sort of passion and persistence, is that if you have particular challenges in one, pulling from the other to kind of motivate you and to get back in touch with why it's important so that you can persist can be really helpful. So for example, if your child is going through a really difficult developmental phase, you can kind of escape to work, but you can also use the opportunity to develop patience and communication and perspective taking in your work life. And you can sort of do it the other way.
And vice versa.
You can sort of pull out that reason, that sort of motivation to both to persist, but also to, really connect to like why you do it, your underlying why, your superordinate purpose.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And as you well know, there are these brief interventions in psychology, one of the most famous being the values affirmation, where you write about something that you believe is important, and then like all these other things in your life go better. And there are these, it seems like, spillover effects, right? Where, you're maybe having a really terrible day at work, and you're disappointed and discouraged, but then, at dinner, you get to be with these people who are just delighted to see you, and it kind of fills your cup. Yeah. I don't want to say that that's the only reason why the values affirmation works, but there is something about kind of, having the assurance that you're okay, and you're important and you matter. That is one of many benefits of being both working and a parent. You also mentioned there's skills that you might develop, right? I think that for me, whatever skills I have, and they're not anything to brag about in terms of being able to manage my temper and then just my emotion in general, and to work with other people, right? Because we're all emotional creatures, that's being human. I would say that if there were a a high intensity training for that, it would be being with my daughters. And then if I can do that, oh, no problem. Working with graduate students or collaborators, I'm yeah, I've got a teenage daughter, I'm good. So yeah, I completely agree with that point also.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about that too, because I think, grit gets captured by this, simple equation of passion and persistence. And I've also heard you say, but that's not the, passion and persistence are just a part of what it takes to be successful, but also there might be nuance to how grit gets grown. And so I think interpersonal skill and likability seem like they're part and parcel of being successful. Are they part and parcel of being gritty?
I think that, say likability is just one other thing that would be part of the equation of being more likely to succeed in life. I think, yes, it's definitely relevant to being successful, at least in many or most ways. No, it is not part of grit. I remember our common friend Barry Schwartz, psychologist at Swarthmore and just mensch extraordinaire.
He's such a mensch.
He's such a mensch. He's super mensch. And if you're listening to this and you want to meet Barry, go try. I highly recommend it. Your life will be better. And Barry was at the time at Swarthmore as a professor. I was coming up in the world as a, hoping to be tenured professor someday. And I, of course, was clueless and didn't know what I was doing and was going in a million different directions. And I remember having this conversation with Barry where I started to think about all the other things that, mattered for achievement, like luck. And you mentioned, likability, or you could say more broadly, social skills. And there's also creativity and curiosity. I mean, the list, starts getting really long when you really consider wait a second, that's not all. And Barry gave me very good advice, which he said, you don't want, as a psychologist, to define your idea, your construct, to use jargon, more and more inclusively, just to include everything there is under the sun that might be relevant to the outcome that you're studying. I mean, there have to be some boundaries on what's useful to call grit, and then when it starts to become something else, right? And I think likability falls outside of grit. I think we can think of really tenacious people who are, obsessively committed and really hard workers who aren't especially likable, or even, it's not hard to bring to mind a dislike, gritty paragon that you maybe know personally or as a public figure. So I think likability is different. I, by the way, when I was in graduate school, was tempted to study two other things than I eventually ended up studying. Grit and effort and self-control and all that. The psychology of, basically goal-directed energy is what I ended up studying. But the two other things, one, it was likability or charisma, that whole category of who's an attractive person interpersonally. And then the second thing I didn't study, but the third thing I could have studied, I guess, I chose the first of three, was the placebo effect.
Oh, those are different.
They are. And I, always, I don't have regrets. I'm just very curious about those other topics.
Well, I think likability is so interesting. And the reason that I wanted to ask you is in reading your book, you come across as very likable in your writing. And it's so cute on your podcast with Stephen Dubner. He's constantly pointing out how likable you are. And I just think it's, part of why it seems that likability is so attached to success. And I think this really comes through in your book, is that you're able to develop relationships with colleagues whose expertise you can rely on, with interviewees whose stories they're willing to share, with folks who kind of come into your life whose interests are very different than yours. Like you went and visited with the Seattle Seahawks coach and spoke with a comedian, and I think
who is very likable, by the way.
Well, and I think your ability to form connections really does lead to success, but it is useful to note that that's a really different construct. It can, and that grit is just one element that leads to success. And I think that that's, as I understand it, one of the criticisms that sometimes gets lodged against your work, which is that it almost sounds like you're suggesting that grit is the only thing. And I think you are if one is to read your work more closely, it's very clear that you say this is just one of the elements that matters.
I tried to explain regression coefficients and incremental predictive validity to a fact checker at the New York Times once, because the fact checker calls me up, and this is years ago, so I can't even remember what article it was for. And they say, so you're saying that grit's the only thing that matters for success? And I was like, nope. And they were like, okay, you're saying it's not the only thing, but it's the most important thing. Nope. They're like, well, you say that grit predicted over and above intelligence. And I was like, yes, over and above in the regression model, which I'm going to explain to you in a second. That means incrementally, it means in addition to. So then I tried to explain all this and basically give regression modeling 101 to a non-trained scientist. And I will say this, they made a valiant effort to try to understand that. I made a valiant effort to attempt to explain, it is a criticism that, Angela says that, grit is so much more important than it really is. I think that partly that allegation is understandable in that when you give a TED talk, right, which is end to end, the one I gave was 6 minutes or something, right? It's how much nuance can you pack in to 360 seconds, right? Turns out not a lot.
Unless you talk very, very fast.
Yeah, maybe I should have done it at 2x and just cheated and had a 12-minute TED. But even then, right? How much can you pack into 12 minutes? And then even when you write a book, I wrote the book as carefully as I could, but I do remember early versions that nobody ever saw except for my editor. So my editor was named Rick Horgan, and I would send him drafts, like any author does, I'm sure you are as well for your book. And, I would say I have done as good a job as I can in explaining a binary logistic regression model for my West Point study. And I think it's damn near poetry, right? And he would read it and he'd be like, there's just no poetry that is going to make the average person want to delve into the details of your binary logistic regression model. And he eventually convinced me to, try to communicate in a way that was simple enough that a very broad audience could understand. But the criticism then is wait, you didn't explain odds ratios or confidence intervals, or you put all this stuff in the end notes that you probably should have put in the front. And, one of my inspirations in life, I guess professionally at least, is William James, who, as you know, was at Harvard in the psychology department in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And he was very ahead of his time in that he gave these lectures publicly that would have been called TED Talks if they had that word back then. But he called them talks to teachers because that was actually the trustees of Harvard asked him to give these public talks. It's like giving science away. He would have had a podcast like you maybe if he had been born today. And in the opening lecture to this Talks to Teachers series that he went around and gave again and again at, little churches and in, public areas where they would have him, he said that there is, so much value in understanding psychologically what's going on with people, and that he wanted to share a little bit without a lot of jargon to a broad audience. And he said in that opening lecture, if I burden you with all the technical terms and all the complexity, you're not going to make it through the lecture. And I think that allegation is both understandable, and yet for anybody who ever tries to actually do this, like you try to explain to somebody like anything, right, without some amount of nuance or complexity, unfortunately being lost, in order to keep people awake. It's not that I disagree entirely with the allegation, but I think it's better to try than to never try to communicate, what I think are reasonably valuable insights about human nature.
Yeah. And I agree that you're a little bit damned if you do and damned if you don't. But I think on balance, it's such a gift to be able to be somebody in academia who's translating your findings for the public, because, that's a crossover that doesn't happen nearly enough, because there is all this really valuable information, and clinical psychology is one of the domains that, we have so much to offer. So I think the more that academics get out and share those kind of scientific findings in ways that are accessible, I think that's just a huge gift.
We're getting better at it. I mean, we're getting better at it. The public's getting more sophisticated. Most people in the world, know something about what it means to have an experiment or like a control condition, and these are like relatively sophisticated concepts. So I think we're all getting better at it.
So in that vein, I actually wanted to ask a specific question about grit that I think is a nuance that comes through clearly in your writing, but that sometimes gets lost in like the short blogs that might be written about
translation.
Grit, grit is sort of like passion and persistence towards a goal, even when you hit roadblocks. And one of the criticisms that I've heard is that it doesn't highlight that there are times when you should quit, you should pivot and change directions. And so I wonder if you can explain what your philosophy on how grit fits into like when to pivot.
Yeah, when to grit and when to quit would be one way to ask that question. And I think it's a very good one, because you can imagine, and in fact, I don't have to imagine much because I've done this before, like the pursuit of a stupid goal stubbornly, that is actually now crowding out energy that you could put towards a better goal, right? Like I have, worked on papers where like it took me 9 years to publish it. Now, am I glad I published it? Sure. Could I have been doing something else in those 9 years that was more profitable? Probably. And most important, I think that sometimes my willingness to just like put in more energy, like, work on it another year, stay up a little later, has gotten me into trouble, because I probably with that particular paper could have figured out a way to do 95% of what I was doing in 1/9 the time, right? Like, did I really have to email every person who had ever written a paper on self-control personally and ask them if they had a correlation coefficient that they could share for my meta-analysis, and then like make a big spreadsheet of everybody who hadn't replied? And then, I mean, there are things where I think if you are too gritty and in a narrow way, in a kind of strangely myopic way, ironically, like you can actually get yourself into the problem of like wasting energy when it could have been spent in a different way better. I think the recommendation I have is that people ought to try for the following. Try to keep your grit for your higher level goals. Like I do have a highest level. So you mentioned superordinate goals. I mean, I've recently in the last year, like realized that probably the most succinct way I can phrase my top level professional goal is to increase psychological literacy.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. I've been teaching this class to undergraduates, and, I'm having them reflect on their goals, and I do all the same homework assignments that my students do.
That.
So in the course of that experience, I thought like, I think what I'm really trying to do is increase psychological literacy. I used to say, and I still do, right? Increase or use psychological science to help kids thrive. But more and more, as I realize that like that means that superintendents of school districts and congressmen and moms and, uncles and aunts and neighbors and pastors and imams, like if we could make everybody a little more psychologically literate, a little more psychologically wise, then really that's the name of the game, right? Like that, then every child would grow up with all these like grown-ups in their life who knew a little bit better about like why it is that people cry and, why we smile and, what makes for a good friendship and why people give up on things and why sometimes they don't give up on things. So anyway, I think I should be extremely gritty about that highest level goal. Right. And I don't know what would make me give it up. But I think if it's a very particular low level goal, it's like, get this grant from this foundation, develop a paper with this particular person, then I think you should be flexible, actually. And I have in my life, like countless times, I think been gritty at the wrong level of my goal hierarchy.
Well, that's an interesting reflection on your own life. And I can actually say that I've done the same thing. But one thing that comes up for me, so I and all of my co-host colleagues practice acceptance and commitment therapy, which is an evidence behavioral therapy. But it really relies on this clarified value idea. So like, and I think that superordinate goal is in a sense your highest level value. And then the objective is to identify committed actions that kind of align with your higher level values. And then underneath, what you're always aiming for in acceptance and commitment therapy is to develop something called psychological flexibility, which is the ability to persist or desist depending both on your values and on your internal and external circumstances. So for example, in the example that you just gave, if you get a grant application rejected, you kind of check yourself about what your values are and then figure out, given the circumstances, are there other foundations that you can apply to, or should you, pivot towards a different goal that sort of serves that same value. And so I actually think that the idea of grit and how you build it is very aligned with some of the philosophies of acceptance and commitment therapy.
Now I'm going to have to use a little self-control because now all I want to do is interview you because I'm very interested in acceptance and commitment therapy. I think it goes by the acronym ACT.
I actually was just listening to your episode with Stephen Dubner about acronyms versus initialization. I can't remember what the words were, but it's ACT.
Oh, it is ACT. So it is an acronym, not an initialism, actually, I should say. So it goes by. And I was curious in two ways, if you don't mind my asking. So I'm not clinically trained, and I only know of ACT. So I haven't actually participated in ACT as a therapist or as a client. But how would you relate ACT to cognitive behavioral therapy? Like, is it cognitive behavioral therapy plus mindfulness? And then a second question, which may or may not be related. So I was recently talking to like a hedge fund manager, and he said, oh, well, kind of the only thing you need to know about psychology is ACT. And then he said, like the ACT hexagon. So I Googled ACT hexagon, and I was like, whoa, this is so interesting. So I would love to know more about how ACT is different from cognitive behavioral therapy and what its relationship to mindfulness would be. And I'm also really curious about this like ACT hexagon that I found on Google Images.
Yeah. So, and it's sort of the 6 core processes that all feed into psychological flexibility. And they are acceptance, mindfulness, values, committed action, self as context, and then diffusion. So like being able to unhook from your thoughts. And so the way that ACT differs from CBT is that CBT really focuses on changing thoughts in order to change our emotional experiences, and then also to kind of set us up for behaviors that are more adaptive. Acceptance and commitment therapy focuses more on your relationship to both your thoughts and your emotions. So it's the idea that sometimes we can't change them, but what we can work on is changing how we relate to them. And so, for example, if you have a thought of, I'm a really bad podcaster and my voice sounds very childish, you might not be able to delete that thought because it's a practice thought and we can't delete neural pathways, but we can pay less attention to them and or learn to relate to them differently.
That is so interesting. So it's more meta. It's like a metacognitive. Like it's like you don't have to change the thought itself.
Exactly.
This kind of like I could pay attention to it. I could not pay attention. I could be distant from it.
And the same goes for emotions, that you can notice the feelings of anxiety or sadness and then reconnect to your value and pick a committed action. And again, just coming back to grit, I think that can fit because you might say I'm having a year where I have a very young child. And so I can sort of back off of some of the goals, but still keep the ball moving, even if more slowly, towards some of the higher order goals that have been true for me for a number of years. And this kind of gets to the work-family enrichment that I think is a little bit related to the job crafting idea. But if you learn to relate to it in a way that says, slowing down and spending more time with my family will help me recharge for my work. It might help me learn some interpersonal skills like some patience. And I can use that to feed my professional or other kinds of superordinate goals. Then that can be a way that you build grit even as you're slowing down in some of your activities. And again, I don't know that necessarily works, but that's a little bit of how I sometimes think about it.
Yeah, I really love that. And, you talked about aligning with your core values as part of ACT. And, one of the things that has become increasingly clear to me when I ponder the people I interview who are paragons of grit, and I just try to understand them, who is this 3-star Michelin chef? What makes them tick? How do they relate to themselves in the world? I think that what really underlies all this passion and perseverance, that is the kind of obvious phenotype, if you will, of grit, is an alignment. What do I mean? Well, what I do and what I say and what I want and what I want to want and what I want to want to want. And in fact, my highest level goal, it's all aligned. There's, and then if you're well, what else is there? How could it not be? It's plenty of ways. It could be misaligned. You could have goal conflict. What I have to do today is not what I want to do, or what I want to do is not what I want to do, right? And when I think about happiness, more and more, I think that fulfillment, happiness, a feeling, there are days where I could tell you, Yael, I just feel great. The most recent memory of this was to illustrate this alignment idea. This kind of there's a kind of harmony, my values, what I'm doing, what I want to do, and the absence of conflict. I was walking back from dropping off flowers to Katy Milkman, who just had published her book it was the Tuesday that her book came out. And I remember looking at my schedule and figuring out that just barely, if I speed walked, I could go to the florist, pick up the flowers that would match her book cover, just when the florist opened, drop them off, turn tail, and speed walk home before my Zoom call, and as I was rushing home, I remember thinking consciously, this is great. I'm doing what I want to do. I wanted to express some affection for my academic BFF. I, really like walking, by the way. I really do. I'm this is fun. I'm out and, taking a brisk walk in the morning. I feel like I'm, doing what my mother always taught me to do, which is, I always think I am my mother's daughter. Anytime I do anything vaguely kind, I'm well, that's because I am my mother's daughter. And that kind of alignment, that's happiness. Yeah. Right. And then when I think about my lowest lows, it's always because there's some kind of corrosive goal conflict. It's oh God, we have to go here and spend all of Saturday. And I don't want to spend Saturday that way. What I really want to. And so I kind of feel I'd love to learn more about ACT and how it overlaps with sorts of things I had previously been studying, because I really feel if people could be in alignment with their core values, they would be productive and fulfilled and happy. And then if you ask the question, well, what if they're evil or whatever? I'm you know what? Most people's, I think, deepest core values, maybe not all, but the vast majority are really good. That's why all the heroes in movies are doing good things, not bad things, so I'm very, not just sympathetic, but I guess enthusiastic about that particular tenet of ACT.
If you're looking for a great way to support us here at Psychologists Off the Clock and make your life easier and healthier, you should go to my new favorite online store, Thrive Market. Thrive Market carries all your grocery and household essentials with the convenience of getting everything online and then quickly shipped right to your door. And right now, you can get 30% off your first order plus a free $60 gift if you go to thrivemarket.com/POTC. I love that I can use specific filters to curate my shopping experience so I can find organic meats and low sugar snacks for my kids. Plus, when you join, they give to a family in need. How cool is that? So join in on the savings with Thrive Market today and get 30% off your first order plus a free $60 gift. Go to thrivemarket.com/POTC for 30% off plus a free $60 gift. That's THRIVE market.com/POTC. thrivemarket.com/POTC.
I know I talk about my kids a lot, but I also have two adorable dogs, Tilly and Hazel. We love to spoil them, which is why we love Whole Life Pet. Whole Life Pet makes single ingredient treats, meal mixers, supplements, and hydrating snacks for both dogs and cats. And if you try out Whole Life Pet, you're surprising your pets with fun new flavors while also supporting Psychologists Off the Clock. Visit wholelifepet.com and use promo code POTC to get 25% off your first order with free shipping over $50. When I open the Tuscan Blend Bistro Bowl meal mixer to add to Tilly and Hazel's food, they start wildly sniffing and can't wait to dig in. The best part is Whole Life Pet uses a freeze-dried process that locks in nutrients and freshness, and they never add chemicals, additives, preservatives, or anything artificial. Visit wholelifepet.com and use promo code POTC to get 25% off your first order with free shipping over $50. If you're unsure about what to try, you can fill out their short questionnaire by clicking the red Start Today button on the home page. It will ask you a few questions and make custom product recommendations for your pets. Visit wholelifepet.com and use promo code POTC to get 25% off today.
We've had a number of guests who want to offer you, our listeners, discounted access to some of their fantastic programs. So if you want to learn powerful practices for happiness, calm, and well-being, we have several offerings from Rick Hansen. If you want app-based behavior change, you can check out Judd Brewer's apps for anxiety, eating well, and smoking cessation. Or you can learn how to be a calmer parent with Mindful Mama mentor Hunter Clark Fields. So go to our website, offtheclockpsych.com, and visit our offers page, where you will find access to free courses and discount promo codes.
Well, that kind of gets me to another question, which is just a broad question of what your recommendations are for growing grit, because, a lot of the time we have to do things that we don't want to do. Let me frame it as one of my podcast colleagues asked. He said, if you can offer 3 simple steps to train your grit every day, he would love that.
1, 2, 3. Well, there are lots of things that are like that. Except the trick is doing them every day. Like if I could actually do the darn exercises my physical therapist assigned me, and there is really like 1, 2, 3 like every day, then I would. But that is why we are behavioral scientists who keep trying to.
Right. That's why Katy Milkman's book is going to be so successful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Start with reading How to Change. Okay. Well, one suggestion would be actually, and I'm not kidding, to read and to listen to podcasts. And I make that recommendation for a few reasons. One is that I do think having like a kind of like deeper understanding, right? Like kind of like, oh, I get it. Their thoughts and their feelings. We have relationships with them. Like, oh, this is what a goal is. Like, this is what it is to have like a superordinate goal. Like, that's super helpful. And if you get it through books, great. And if you get it through podcasts, great. And if you get it through both, then you're like the people that I study, because oftentimes when I'm interviewing somebody who's like a multiple time gold medalist in the Olympics, or a CEO of a huge global company, and I get to sort of like, what are their personal habits? I mean, they're all like self-development nerds. I mean, they just love reading things. They read Dale Carnegie, they read Danny Kahneman, they're listening to podcasts, and they're constantly trying to fine tune their morning routine and so forth. So I think reading is great. Dick Nisbett, who's one of the great psychologists ever, and also a very kind person. One year I had all these high school kids in the lab, and we asked Dick Nisbett to talk to them. And so he gave them like a little mini lecture on social psychology. And I won't forget this. He said to them, now you young people, I know you're on your phones or on your screens. He was like, I just want to tell you something very important. He was like, read. There's no substitute for the kind of thinking and learning you can do when you read. And Tolstoy, at the end of his life, apparently said that, like, it was a great discovery for him to realize that, like, all the people who have ever written a book, like, you can still talk to them, no matter what century they lived in or what village they grew up in. You can talk to the greatest minds in civilization if you read. So number one, because it's 1, 2, 3. One is read or listen to thoughts about this thing called human nature. Then the second thing I would say is one of the things I read actually is Us Weekly. Actually, pretty much without exception, I'm a pretty loyal reader of Us Weekly. I know I probably shouldn't because of all the terrible things it's like objectifying, but anyway, I do. And I remember reading about Bethany Frankel, like the Real Housewife, Bethany Frankel, and she was doing some new ventures. And in this little interview, she said, I'm the kind of person that's like, as soon as I have an idea, without a lot of delay, I literally just start. It's just like, I'm just go, go, go. And I think that's great advice. So I'm thinking of another woman entrepreneur named Ellen Marie Bennett. She started out as a line cook, and she came from nothing, actually relatively poor side of the family from Mexico, et cetera. And one day the chef in the restaurant was putting in orders for aprons. And Ellen had thought to herself, before she had any reason to be able to think she could do it, that she could make all the aprons for the chef and that restaurant. And then maybe she could do something like have a company that made aprons. And that is exactly what she did. She built a multi-million-dollar brand with collaborations like Vans and Top Chef. And Ellen Marie Bennett is just like, oh, okay, I'll do it. And so I think the second suggestion is, don't spend all your time reading. Like, when you have an idea, as Goethe is sometimes quoted as, but I think it's a slight elaboration of Goethe, whatever it is you can do or think you can do it. Action has power, magic, and beauty to it. Okay, that's a second recommendation. And the third one is, I think, like, find your way into a family. And by that, I mean, some of us are very lucky to have been born with parents who are loving and challenging and wonderful role models. And we just had graduation at my University of Pennsylvania, and I got to meet the families of some of my students. And they were, without exception, the kind of loving, wonderful families that I know, like, incubate lots of good things. But if you're not fortunate to have been born into such a wonderful, nurturing network with a terrific PhD advisor, then go find one. Tonight, I'm going to have over for dinner a student who unfortunately lost his family, but he is so wonderful. Like, he found other people, including me. Like, he's graduating. Like, we're going to celebrate tonight, but he's not biologically my kid. I just met him 4 years ago, and I know there are other faculty and mentors who feel exactly the same way. Like, we're so proud that Eli's graduating, and, we're going to be like rooting for him, his whole life. So 1, read. 2, don't spend all your time reading, do something. And 3, find yourself a family who will take care of you and who you will take care of.
I love that. I'm sort of thinking that it fits into like a triumvirate of like think, act, and connect. And those are 3 ingredients for really thriving. And I love the reading recommendation.
Yael, when you say like, well, those 3 things that, I mean, look, I didn't think about the answer to that question in advance because you didn't give it to me in advance. And that's what was off the top of my head. But I will say thinking, doing, and let's call the last one about family, like relating, right? You could also call it loving, or like thinking, doing, loving, thinking, doing, relating, thinking, doing, connecting. But like, I do think these are the 3 tasks of human beings. And I think it's very deep. Like, I think if you actually map like theories of self-service, like, anyway, I don't want to use jargon, but like lots of theories in motivation and personality come down to like, there are ways that people think, how open-minded are you or not, how like, curious are you or not. There are the ways to think, and there are ways to think better. There are ways of doing, are you proactive or do you hang back? Do you persist or do you give up early? So there's ways of doing. And the last one about relating or loving or connecting, those are the 3 major tasks. And if you can do those reasonably well, hopefully based on good psychologically wise advice in part from scientists, then, it's hard to imagine that your life won't go better. Not that you'll have a perfect life, but kind of thriving. Yeah, it kind of comes down to that. My dad was not a trained psychologist. He was a chemist. And he used to say to me, there are thinkers, doers, and charmers. And then he would say, most people can't be more than one or maybe two, but almost nobody is three. And I remember when he told me this, I was like a little girl. And like most things my dad said, I immediately wanted to prove him wrong. But I do think that we can be all three, right? Like, why can't we think well and act well and relate well? Like, I think that's a good formula for living a good life.
That sounds like a nice superordinate goal. So before I let you go, I know that our time is short, but just given that recommendation, the first one of reading, and because it's clear that you're a reader, I'm curious, have you read anything particularly inspiring in the past year that you'd want to share?
Yeah, well, let's see. And also, since I don't sleep well, I actually read a lot. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's like in the middle of the night when I wake up and I can't go back to sleep. But I always read before I go to bed. So in addition to Us Weekly, which I'm not even sure I recommend. Okay, so here's some books that I have read in the last year that I super recommend. In addition to, Katie's book, and then just in the category of behavioral science, Bob Cialdini's revised his classic Influence. And I just really loved the revision. Adam Grant's Think Again. Danny Kahneman has written another instant classic called Noise, which comes out this week, I think. I read all these behavioral science books and I'm like, this is amazing. I love that people are writing, books. I look forward to reading your book, Yael, as well. Then in the category of not behavioral science, I read a memoir. I love memoirs. And I super love this memoir called I Am a Girl from Africa. I read it almost all in one sitting. It's by a woman named Elizabeth Nyamayaro, if I pronounced her last name right. And it's a really beautifully written story of a beautiful life. And if you're a memoir lover, just buy it's a yellow book, I Am a Girl from Africa. And then finally, I'll just say what I'm reading exactly now, as in what I will look forward to reading tonight. My cousin Jessica got me 4 teen fantasy novels that she thought I would enjoy, and she got it for my birthday. And she was like, look, I'm sending them to your Kindle. So if you don't like them, they won't fill any landfills. So you can feel guilt-free. And of course, I love them. So yeah, I've heard very wise parents, be very careful about things that their kids can't watch, like TV shows but this very capable parent whose 3 daughters, one ended up running YouTube. The other one is the CEO of 23andMe. And the third is a award-winning scientist. She said, this is Esther Wojcicki. She said, I was careful what I let them watch and do, but I let them read anything because reading is just almost always great. And I was thinking that's not bad parenting advice.
Yeah. I love that your reading tastes run the gamut, really, from Us Weekly to Goethe.
Hard to categorize.
But I love that. I mean, and just sort of a last note on grit, grit is one superordinate goal, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a lot of activities that are in lots of different domains and that are both hard moving forward and that are just really pleasant and sort of decompressing. So I think
in their own right.
Wait, I did have one more question, which is, I heard you say that you're never going to write another book, but grit was so good. Why? And how can I convince you to write another book?
Okay, just as you're asking me this, literally this week, tomorrow, I'm going to be talking to my agent and my editor for Grit. And I think I am going to write another book, Yael. And I think it will be, have you ever read the cookbook Salt, Fat, Acid? I love reading cookbooks. Even if I never cook out of them, I still love reading them. And I sometimes cook out of them. But I'll say this. There is this cookbook named Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And it makes the claim that if you can understand salt, fat, acid, and heat, and if you get those 4 elements right, they're kind of like the latitude and longitude of cooking, and your food will taste better. And if you get one or more of those wrong, your food is not going to taste that great. And when this chef, Samin Nosrat, wrote it, it was the kind of thing where it's like before she wrote it, everyone thought like, how would anybody write such a book and why would you? And then afterwards it was like, oh my God, why didn't I write that book? So said the chefs that I interviewed about it. And I thought maybe I would try to write that for human behavior, right? So like, what are the most important things? Like, what's the highlight reel that you would want to know? And that's why in part I was so interested in ACT. I was like, wait a second, maybe ACT has like a lot, maybe not everything, but like maybe everything. Anyway, I'm really interested in like, putting everything that anybody has done in clinical, social psychology, behavioral economics, et cetera, into one book that has a little warmth and memoir feel to it.
Oh, and God. Well, if anyone can synthesize that level of amount of material and depth of material, it would be you, and it would be amazing. Daunting. So I hope you take that challenge on because I would love to read that.
I will let you know. I will keep you posted.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy anniversary, 200.
And we'll link to characterlab.org. And I definitely recommend anybody out there who hasn't already read it to pick up Grit because it's amazing. Thank you, Angela.
Thanks, Yael. I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and you can connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
We'd like to thank our strategic consultant, Michael Harold, our dissemination coordinator, Katie Rothfelder, and our editorial coordinator, Melissa Miller.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're having a mental health emergency, dial 911. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our webpage, offtheclockpsych.com.